In Harding County, the fields go quiet before dawn. Cold air, no wind. 42 acres of standing hay stretched across the southwest section, 3 weeks from harvest, worth an entire winter. Then a hand reaches up in the dark, slow, deliberate. The latch lifts clean without a sound. 4 minutes later, 63 cattle pour through an open gate. A young woman races across the field arms, waving, watching her winter disappear beneath hundreds of hooves. She stops at the fence line, studies the gate. The hinges aren't broken, the chain isn't snapped, nothing is forced. She crouches down, gets close. Morning dew covers everything: the post, the wire, the chain. But the inside of the latch is dry, clean. Someone touched this. Recently. Carefully. Up on the ridge above the damaged field, a white truck sits parked, engine running, and the man behind the wheel is smiling. The dark was complete at 5:21 in the morning. Not the soft kind of dark that fades at the edges. The hard kind. The kind that sits on the fields like something with weight. The kind that makes a person feel like the world stopped turning while they slept and hasn't quite started again. Nothing moved on the county road. No headlights. No wind. Just the fence line running along the western boundary of Ferris Farm. Just the gate standing there in the coal black air. Just the smell of dew and turned earth and the faint sweet rot of a field working its way towards something. And a hand, reaching up, slow, deliberate. No hesitation in it at all. The fingers found the latch, the way a person finds a latch they have found 100 times before. Not fumbling, not searching, just reaching, lifting, pulling. One smooth motion, like breathing, like something ordinary. The gate swung open without a sound. Somewhere in the grass, 12 feet away, a trail camera registered the shift in heat. The red glow LED blinked once, a single dim pulse of light against all that darkness. Then it went quiet again. The hand let go of the gate. Footsteps, retreating, the soft creak of a truck door, an engine turning over, tires on gravel slow at first, then faster heading back the way they came. And the gate stood open in the dark, just standing there, like it had been waiting. Willa Ferris had been awake since 4:30, not because she set an alarm, because that was when her body had started waking up on its own, years ago, trained by the kind of routine that doesn't need a clock. By the time she pulled on her jeans in the dark, she already knew the temperature from the way the air felt against her ankles. Cold, sharp, still holding last night's chill. She made coffee and didn't drink it sitting down. She moved through the kitchen the way she moved through everything. Steady, not rushing, checking things in order because order was the only system she had. Coffee, jacket, the worn canvas one hanging by the door. Caramel brown, gone soft at the elbows from years of use. She shrugged it on over her flannel shirt and zipped it to the collar and tucked her braid inside the hood because the mornings had been cold enough to mean it. The screen door swung behind her. Outside, the farm materialized slowly out of the dark. The barn, the water tanks, the long shape of the fence running west toward the neighbor's land. Willa walked the same path she walked every morning, checking the mineral feeders first, then the tank floats, then the fence line on the east side just to see. She kept a notebook in her jacket pocket, small, spiral bound. Half the pages were already full. She wrote things down: dates, temperatures, what she'd fixed, what still needed fixing, how much hay was in the barn, how much was still standing in the field, how many days until she could cut. Her mother had kept the same kind of notebook. Her father before that. There were boxes of them in the back bedroom stacked against the wall in years she couldn't quite count anymore. The Ferris farm was 75 acres, which sounds like a lot until you start doing the math. Until you realize that 75 acres worked right barely covers the cost of running 75 acres. Until you account for the vet bills and the equipment and the fuel and the seed and the fertilizer and the moments when something breaks and you have to fix it with what you have, because what you have is what there is. Willa ran the numbers the way her mother had taught her, carefully, conservatively, never spending a dollar that hadn't been planned for twice. The hayfield was the number that mattered most right now. 42 acres of it in the southwest section, and every single one of those acres was almost ready. 3 weeks away, maybe less if the weather held. The grass had come in thick this year, healthy, the kind of stand that a farmer doesn't take credit for because weather did most of the work, but tends carefully because the weather can also take it away. 55 bales, maybe 60 if she was lucky, each one representing winter. Each one representing a month of feed she wouldn't have to buy. A month she wouldn't have to load into her truck and haul from the co-op. A month she wouldn't have to charge to the operating line at the bank and then spend the rest of the season trying to pay back. She stopped at the top of the small rise where she could see the hayfield spreading out below her. The grass was still dark in the early light, dew on everything, quiet enough that she could hear the cattle breathing at the far end of the pasture, that low collective sound like a single large animal resting. She took a breath, and for one moment, just one, everything was the way it was supposed to be. She had been 19 when her parents died. Not 19 and almost 20. Not 19 and nearly done with school. Just 19. In the spring, when the world is supposed to be opening up. The accident had happened on Route 9 in wet weather, in the kind of way that accidents happen suddenly and completely, and without any of the dramatic warning that grief in retrospect feels like it deserved. One morning she had parents. That afternoon she had a farm. She had never thought of it as a burden. Even in those first terrible weeks, when she didn't know how to file half the paperwork that needed filing and couldn't figure out the settings on the irrigation timer, and cried in the barn more often than she'd ever admit out loud. Even then, this was theirs, so it was hers. It had taken her the better part of 4 years to feel like she knew what she was doing. 4 years of making mistakes small enough that they didn't break the whole thing. 4 years of reading every book her mother had left on the shelf, every notebook, every margin note, written in Dana Ferris's small, careful handwriting. Her mother had kept a journal too, not just a farming journal, a real one. The kind where she wrote down how things felt as well as how things were. Willa had read parts of it before, but there were sections she'd skimmed over, things that seemed like ordinary worry at the time. The kind of entries a daughter reads and thinks she was tired, everyone gets tired, that's just a hard season. She hadn't gone back to those entries, not yet. She had been walking the fence line on the east side when she first heard Warren Doss's truck 3 years ago. She'd known who it was before she turned around. Everybody in this part of Harding County knew that white pickup. Everybody knew the logo painted on the door, a bold D, inside a circle. Doss Ranch, 1-800 acres. He'd gotten out of the truck with the easy, unhurried movement of a man who has never been told no in a way that actually stuck. He'd touched the brim of his hat, said he didn't think they'd properly met, told her he'd been watching the farm for a while, said he admired how she was keeping things going, said she was doing real well for someone so young. And then he'd made his offer. She told him the farm wasn't for sale. He'd smiled like he'd expected her to say that. Nodded, said he understood, said the offer would stand if she ever changed her mind. He'd come back 6 months later. That time the framing was different, more gentle, more reasonable. He talked about how running a farm alone was a lot for anyone suggested. She'd think about her future, mentioned that land like this didn't get easier to manage. The farm wasn't for sale. He'd smiled again. The same smile both times. The kind of smile that doesn't quite reach anywhere useful. The third time he'd stood at her gate with the truck running behind him and looked out over the hayfield with something in his eyes that wasn't admiration anymore. Something quieter. Something that had more patience in it than she was comfortable with. I hope things stay manageable for you. Real careful, real slow. I'd hate to see you get to a point where you didn't have options. The farm wasn't for sale. He'd climbed back in his truck and driven away, and the smile had stayed on his face the whole time, which was the thing that sat with her afterward. Not what he'd said, but the fact that it had never not been there. She heard it at 7:05, rumbling. The sound of a herd moving, not grazing slow, moving fast. The difference between those two sounds is something you know in your chest before you know it in your head, and Willa Ferris's chest knew it before she'd even lifted her eyes from the water tank float she was adjusting. She turned. At first, she counted the way you count when you're not believing what you're seeing. 1, 5, 10. More kept coming. Through the opening in the western fence where the gate should have been standing closed. Through the opening where the gate was now swinging wide in the morning air. 63 black Angus cattle spilling through in a loose-flowing mass, and they were already spreading across the field before she'd taken a single step toward them. She climbed into the utility vehicle. She drove fast. She was waving her arms before she even reached the field's edge, shouting across the open air, and the cattle ignored her completely. The way cattle ignore everything that isn't a predator or a bucket of feed. They moved through the standing hay like it was nothing, which it was to them. Grass, just grass. They put their heads down and started in. Willa stopped the vehicle at the edge of the destruction and stood there, and looked at what was happening to her winter. The hay was thick enough to see the difference immediately. Dark, crushed trails where the cattle had walked. Flattened sections spreading out from each trail as they moved apart. Hoof prints pressing down into the soil. The kind of pressure that doesn't just bend a plant, that cracks the stem at the joint, that pushes the root plate sideways. That doesn't just mean this cutting is gone, but means the next one might be thinner and the one after that thinner still. She could feel the numbers shifting in her head, feel them adjusting, feel them getting worse. She stood there for 3 seconds, and then she took out her phone. She walked the fence line first, every step of it, slow and deliberate, because emotion wasn't going to tell her anything useful, but photographs might. She documented the crushed sections nearest the gate, then the gate itself, the hinges, the chain, the post. Nothing broken, nothing bent, nothing forced. The chain was still attached to the post on one side. The latch was still attached on the other. The whole mechanism was perfectly intact, as if the gate had simply decided to open itself, as if a piece of metal had lifted a piece of metal all on its own. She photographed the latch from one side, then the other, and then she crouched down and photographed it from directly in front. The morning was still full of dew. Everything was wet. The grass carried it, the fence post carried it, the wire had beads of it strung like small lights in the early sun. Her jacket sleeve came back dark when she brushed it against the lower rail. She looked at the latch. The outside of it was wet. The post below it was dark with moisture. The chain where it looped through the ring was damp. But the inner surface of the latch, the underside, the part that a hand would touch when reaching up to lift it, dry, clean, no dew, no grime, no trace of the morning. Willa stayed crouched there and looked at it for a long moment. Her mind said someone held this recently. Her mind said they held it carefully. Her mind said they knew exactly what they were touching and they didn't want to leave marks. She took 4 more photographs, close, from different angles. She placed her water bottle cap on the ground beside it to mark the location in the frame. Then she stood up, reached into the back of the utility vehicle, unfolded the drone case. Because if the latch was the detail you only noticed up close, the scale of the damage was the thing you could only understand from above. The drone went up in the cold morning air, and Willa watched the image on her phone. 42 acres, and the cattle moving through them like ink dropped in water. Dark, irregular trails crossing the green. 63 animals spreading in every direction from the gate following each other, and then separating, sampling the field section by section. She photographed everything. The patterns of movement, the concentrated damage near the entrance where the cattle had bunched before spreading, the sections to the north that were still untouched, the comparison between what was and what had been. She took the photographs methodically overlapping, making sure every section was covered. Because photographs taken in the field an hour after an event are the only photographs that can tell you what the field looked like an hour after the event, and an hour goes away fast. She was on her third pass with the drone when she heard the truck. County Sheriff's Department, followed by Warren Doss's white pickup. Then two of his ranch hands in a separate vehicle. She landed the drone. She saved the footage. And she waited. Warren Doss climbed out of his truck with the unhurried movement that was his signature. He wore his ranch jacket and his hat, and his expression of mild regret, the same one a person might wear to a neighbor's minor inconvenience. I walked toward her across the field edge. Looks like we both had a rough morning. Willa looked at. She said nothing. Cattle get out. A small shrug, almost gentle. Latch must have worked loose. She turned and looked at the gate. It didn't look worked loose. Livestock don't exactly file a report. The sheriff walked the fence line, tested the hinges, pulled on the chain, found everything functional, everything intact. He wrote in his notebook for a while, then he looked up and said carefully, like he was reading a legal document, that there was no physical damage to the gate itself, that he'd include everything in his report, but without a witness to the gate being opened, he couldn't classify this as more than escaped livestock. Willa thanked him. She didn't argue. She didn't accuse. She didn't mention the clean latch or the dry underside or the thing her phone was already holding in its memory, because that wasn't the moment for any of that. She just thanked him and went back to documenting the field. Neighbors arrived over the next hour, some in pickups, some on foot. The kind of gathering that happens in small counties when something goes wrong. Not organized, just gravitational. The way people orient toward disruption, the way water orients toward low ground. They said the things people say. These things happen, which was true and useless at the same time. At least nobody got hurt, which was kind and missed the point entirely. You'll have hay again next season, which was the kind of optimism that doesn't cost the person saying it anything at all. Willa thanked every one of them. She meant it. She knew they meant well. She also knew that meaning well and knowing what to do are not always the same thing, and this was one of the moments when they weren't. It took nearly 2 hours to get all 63 cattle moved back through the gate and onto Doss Ranch property. 2 hours of shouting and chasing and redirecting, 2 hours during which the cattle continued to graze and trample while the humans worked to undo the work they'd been doing. Afterward, the field looked like what it was. A field that had 63 large animals moving through it for 2 hours. Willa stood at the western fence line when everyone finally left and looked at what was left of 3 weeks of Almost Ready. She didn't let herself count the losses yet. Not out loud, not in her head. Because if she started that calculation right now, standing here with the crushed grass and the mud and the sky going pale gold above it all, she wasn't sure she could keep her face steady. And she needed to keep her face steady for the next part, which was getting back to work. She checked the drone footage again at noon, sitting in the cab of her truck with a sandwich she was only half eating. The timestamps were clean. The image quality was good. The scale of the damage was visible and documentable and would not require anyone to take her word for it. She opened her notebook. She started writing figures. Conservative estimates first. Affected acreage based on drone imagery. Percentage of crop she expected to lose entirely. Percentage that might recover partially. Percentage that appeared undamaged. She cross-referenced against her mother's old yield records to establish what this section of the field had produced in previous seasons. Then she called the county extension office, asked about the soil impact assessment process, asked what a licensed agricultural consultant would need to calculate replacement feed costs, asked whether drone imagery was considered admissible in civil proceedings in this state. The person on the phone was patient, helpful, and by the end of the call, Willa had 4 names written down and 2 appointments set for the following week. She ate the rest of her sandwich. She drove back to the barn because the cattle still needed to eat today, and the water tank still needed checking, and the fence on the east side had a post that needed resetting before it became a problem. The farm didn't pause for disasters. You either kept up with it or you fell behind, and falling behind was where farms went to die. She kept up. Helen Mackey arrived at 6 in the evening. Willa saw the truck from the field where she was repairing the east fence post and thought for a moment it was someone else. She didn't know Helen well. Not really. Helen had lived in the county most of her life, had run a small operation of her own for 30 years, and then 5 years ago had sold and moved into a rented room behind Boyd Pierce's place. That was the whole story as most people told it. Helen climbed out of the truck slowly. She moved like someone who had learned to be careful with her body. She carried a Dutch oven with both hands. They sat on the porch. Helen poured soup into bowls without asking whether Willa wanted any. And for a few minutes, neither of them said anything because the light was going golden over the damaged field, and it was the kind of quiet that doesn't need to be filled. Then Helen set her bowl down and looked out at the field. "You got pictures," Willa nodded. "All of it, gate and everything." "Everything." Helen was quiet again for a moment, longer than the first time. When she finally looked up, her expression had something complicated in it. Not sadness exactly, not regret exactly. The kind of face a person makes when they're looking at their own past from a safe distance and it's still not quite safe enough. "I did too." A pause. "Didn't know what to do with them," which was all she said about it. She didn't explain. She didn't elaborate. She just looked back out at the field and picked up her bowl again, and Willa sat with the sentence for a while before she understood that it was the beginning of something, not the end of it. Boyd Pierce arrived at 8:30. There was no good reason to expect him. Boyd didn't visit people in the evenings. Boyd didn't visit people often at all, if she was being honest. He was the kind of man who kept his company close and his words closer, who had lived 78 years in this county and seemed to take satisfaction in knowing things he didn't need to say out loud. He knocked once. When she opened the door, he looked at her the way people look when they've decided something. "Got something to show you." He came in and sat at the kitchen table without taking off his jacket. From the inside pocket, he took a folded piece of paper worn at the creases, the kind of wear that comes from years of folding and unfolding. He spread it flat on the table. It was a map, hand-drawn or close to it. A survey map of the county with additional markings added in pen. Boyd's addition, she assumed. 6 small pins marked on the map in red ink, each with a tiny notation beside it. Names. Dates. All 6 properties shared a border with Doss Ranch. She could see that immediately without having to be told. The way all 6 of them ringed the larger property like irregular puzzle pieces that hadn't quite been fit into place yet. She could see the red marks scattered across 5 years. Could see the pattern in the placement even before she understood the details of each one. Boyd pointed slowly. Every one of those properties cattle got out. Every one. She asked what happened after. Same thing every time, he said. Damage, insurance, some repairs, and then selling. All of them. Not right away. Some took a season too, but they all sold. He tapped the map with one finger, just once. Bad weather is random. He looked at the red marks. A gate that opens once, that's bad weather. A gate that opens 6 times across different properties over 5 years with the same neighbor on one side every time. He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Willa looked at the 6 red marks. She was doing the math, property by property, looking at the names written in Boyd's careful handwriting beside each pin, thinking about what it takes to give up a farm, what kind of pressure it requires. Not the first bad season usually, not even the second, but 2 bad seasons in a row with debt carrying over, with the bank calls starting with the cost of repairs, on top of the cost of replacements, on top of the cost of just existing. That was when people started listening to offers they'd refused before. That was when Warren Doss would show up again with his white truck and his patient smile. Boyd folded his hands on the table. He'd never proved anything he said. He wanted her to know that. This was just a map. She asked how long he'd been keeping it. Long enough. She asked why he'd brought it now. He looked at her across the table, and the look had something in it that she recognized. The look of someone who has been waiting for the right person to give something to. "Because you took photographs. The others didn't. Not like this." She nodded, and then Boyd tapped the map one more time. Not one of the outer pins, the one in the middle. The fourth one from the left, the one she hadn't looked at closely yet because it was surrounded by the others, and she'd been looking at the pattern and not the individual marks. He tapped it, and she looked at it. The notation next to pin 4 read F. Ferris, Spring, 7 years ago. Willa looked at it. She looked at it the way you look at your own name written somewhere you didn't put it, the way a person looks at something that was true before they knew it was true. Frank Ferris, her father 7 years ago, which would have been, she counted backward 3 years before his death. 2 years before she went off for that single year of ag school and came back because she missed the place too much to stay away. 4 years before the accident on Route 9 that left everything to her. Her father had had cattle on his field 7 years ago, and apparently one spring a gate had opened, and Boyd knew about it, and nobody had ever said a word. She asked steadily whether Warren had approached him after it happened. Yes, he didn't sell. No. Boyd's hands stayed folded. Your father was a stubborn man. He ran a good farm. He did. Boyd was quiet for a moment. Then he said he should have spoken up sooner, that he hadn't been sure it was his business. It is now. I know it. They sat at the table for a while after that, not talking. Boyd refolded his map and put it back in his pocket. He said he'd make a copy for her if she wanted. She said she did. He said he'd bring it in the morning. He stood up to leave, put on his hat, looked at her from the doorway. You're doing right, he said, which from Boyd was a long speech. Then he was gone, and Willa was alone in the kitchen, with the table, with her notebook, with the numbers she'd been writing all day, and the photographs on her phone, and the map in her head that she could still see perfectly, even though the paper was gone. She stood at the window for a while and looked out at the dark field. Then she turned and looked at the shelf beside the pantry door, the shelf where she kept her mother's journals. She took the most recent one down first. Dana Ferris had kept journals for 30 years. Careful, organized, the kind that were half farm record and half private thought. Willa had read through most of them after her parents died, looking for information, looking for instruction, looking for the voice of a person she was trying to keep present. She'd read the last 2 years' worth most thoroughly, the ones that felt most relevant to running the place. The earlier ones she'd opened and skimmed and set aside for later. This was later. She found the journal from 7 years ago. It was a brown one, soft cover, the spiral binding pulled slightly loose at the top. Her mother's handwriting across the first page, the date. She turned to spring, found the entries from the week Boyd had pinpointed. Her mother had written about the morning the cattle got out. She'd written about the damaged pasture, a different field than the hayfield, a grazing section on the southeast corner. She'd written about Frank's anger, the contained, careful anger that was his way. Not a raised voice, but a quiet hardness that he wore until a thing was fixed. She'd written about Warren Doss coming 3 days later. Frank talked to him for about 20 minutes by the truck, the entry read. I watched from the kitchen. I couldn't hear the words, but I could see Frank's hands. He kept them very still at his sides, the way he does when he's keeping himself from saying what he wants to say. When W drove away, Frank came in and made coffee and didn't say anything for a long time. Then he just said that land has been in this family since my grandfather, and that is how it will stay. Willa sat very still. She read the entry again, then she turned the pages forward, looking for more, looking for the entries she'd skimmed over before, looking for the thing she'd missed because she hadn't known to look for it yet. 3 pages later, she found it. Her mother writing about nights that spring, about Frank getting up at odd hours, about finding him by the window in the dark, looking out toward the west fence. He checks the west gate twice every night now, her mother had written. Before we go to bed and again around midnight. He doesn't explain it. I haven't asked. He just does it, and then he comes back inside, and sometimes I hear him standing at the kitchen window for a while before he comes back to bed. I wonder what he's watching for. Willa set the journal down on the table, looked at the kitchen window, the same dark outside it, the same west fence in the distance, now invisible in the night, but there. She knew it was there. She knew every post. Her father had stood at this window, in this dark, watching the same fence, 7 years ago, because something had happened that he hadn't been able to prove and hadn't been able to forget and had lived with in the way he lived, with everything quietly, carefully, and without burdening anyone else with the weight of it. He'd check the West Gate twice a night. No explanation, just did it, and never told her. And now she was 23 years old and standing in the same kitchen, in the same gate, had been opened again, and this time she had photographs. She had a drone. She had Boyd's map. She had it turned out much more than her father had when he'd stood at this window. She just hadn't known it yet. Willa picked up her notebook. She opened to a new page, and she started writing. 3 days after the cattle, the fields still smelled like them. Not dramatically, not in a way that would make someone stop walking and name it, but Willa could tell. Standing at the edge of the damaged section in the early morning with her coffee going cold in her hand, she could still catch it underneath the dew in the soil and the particular sweetness of crushed grass. The biological fact of 63 large animals pressed into the ground, not yet gone. She'd been out here every morning since, not to grieve it, to measure it. She had a system now. Each morning she photographed the same reference points she'd established on the first day. Same angles, same positions marked with small orange survey flags she'd borrowed from the county extension office. The idea was to create a visual timeline, before and then after that. Because recovery, if there was going to be recovery, would happen slowly and unevenly, and the only way to document it accurately was to establish what you were comparing against. The agricultural consultant was coming on Friday. His name was Gerald Marsh. He'd done this kind of assessment before dozens of times, and when she'd called him, he'd been precise and unsentimental in a way she respected immediately. He'd asked her exactly 3 questions. What was the acreage? What was the crop stage at time of damage? And did she have pre-incident drone imagery? She'd answered yes to all 3. He'd said he'd need 3 hours on site and a copy of her production records from the past 2 seasons. She had all of it ready. Because she'd been preparing for Gerald Marsh since she was standing in this field on the first morning watching the cattle graze through her winter. She hadn't known his name yet. She hadn't known exactly who she'd need. But she'd known she'd need someone, and she'd known that whoever it was would need numbers, and so she'd made the numbers available. Her mother had taught her that. Not directly, not with a lesson plan, just by doing it year after year in those small spiral notebooks that now lived on the shelf by the pantry door. Write things down. Write them down when they happen, because memory lies and paper doesn't. Willa drained the cold coffee and went back to the barn. Cyrus Webb pulled into the driveway at 9 in the morning on a Tuesday. She'd seen him around the county for years without knowing him well. He was the beekeeper who kept hives on 6 different properties in the area. 300 colonies moved seasonally to wherever the flowering was best. He drove a green pickup that always smelled faintly of smoke from his hive equipment, and he had the particular habit of narrating whatever he was looking at in precise detail, as if everything he observed deserved to be described out loud before it became memory. She was replacing a hinge on the barn door when he pulled up. He climbed out and stood by his truck, looked at the barn, looked at the hayfield, looked at the fence line running west. Bad business. I heard about it at the feed store. She nodded, kept working. He stood there for a moment, hands in his pockets. Then he reached back into the truck and pulled out a small metal case, the kind that holds camera equipment or memory cards or both. I wasn't sure I should come. She set down the wrench. He started talking about his bees then, which she'd learned in the 20 minutes she'd known him was the thing he did when he was nervous. He talked about the 2 hives he kept near the western edge of her property on the other side of the fence, technically on Boyd Pierce's land, but close to her field. He talked about coyotes, about how coyotes had been raiding hives in this county for 3 seasons running, and how a knocked-over hive wasn't just a productivity problem, it was 3 years of genetic selection in a single colony lost to a predator that didn't have the decency to even eat the bees. She waited, because she had a feeling about the metal case. So I put cameras up, he said finally, near the hives, red glow trail cameras, motion activated, bears mostly but coyotes too. He stopped, looked at the case. I forgot one of them could see your fence line. I never really paid attention to that side of the footage. Nothing ever happened over there. He held out the case. Until it did. They sat at her kitchen table with his laptop open between them. He'd inserted the memory card. The footage was loading. Willa watched the progress bar and felt something she recognized as hope, which she'd been deliberately not feeling since the morning the cattle came through, because hope without evidence is just a way to hurt yourself more efficiently. But the case was in her hands, and the progress bar was moving. The screen resolved into a night vision image, green, gray, and grainy, but clear enough. The fence line, her fence. The gate visible in the left third of the frame, the post solid and identifiable by the shape of it. Timestamp 5:21 a.m. Nothing moved. And then, headlights, slow, coming from the north along the fence line. A truck pulling up beside the gate and stopping. The red glow LED had caught the side panel clearly enough. Not perfectly, but enough. The Doss Ranch logo, the D inside the circle, on the driver's door. A man got out. He moved directly to the gate. No hesitation, no inspection, no puzzled examination of the latch, no reaching into his jacket for a flashlight. He knew exactly where the latch was and exactly how it worked, and he lifted it with the confidence of someone who had been to this gate before, or had been told precisely what to expect when he arrived. The gate swung open. The man walked back to the truck. The truck drove away. The timestamp read 5:24 a.m. 4 minutes, and then 4 minutes of stillness. Just the open gate, just the dark field, just the screen, until the first black shape moved through the opening. Slow, curious. The way cattle enter a new space, testing it with one step, then another, then deciding the ground was the same ground as anywhere, and putting their head down. Then another cow, and another. Neither of them spoke until the footage ended. Cyrus closed the laptop carefully, like it was something fragile. The jacket has the ranch name on the back. You can see it when he turns. I saw it. He looked at her across the table. He said he went back and forth about coming, that it wasn't a comfortable thing walking into something like this. Then quieter, he'd known her father a little. Not well, but enough to know he ran a clean operation and treated his land right. She held the memory card carefully in both hands. Cyrus, this changes things. He nodded slowly, but something in his face didn't change with it. He looked at the table for a moment before meeting her eyes again. Just make sure it's enough, because I've seen what Warren Doss's lawyers do with footage like this. She didn't know what he meant yet. She would learn soon. Her attorney's name was Patricia Olden. 61 years old, gray hair, kept short glasses she took off and held when she was thinking hard. She'd been doing agricultural and property law in this county for 30 years. Willa had found her through the extension office, through a name written in the margin of a pamphlet about livestock damage claims, through the kind of accidental discovery that later doesn't feel accidental at all. Patricia watched the footage twice. The second time she paused it at the moment the man's jacket was most visible. She leaned closer. She looked at the timestamp. She sat back in her chair and took off her glasses. This is significant. Willa let herself breathe. But it's not complete. She stopped breathing. Patricia set her glasses on the desk. She laced her fingers together. She had the deliberate, measured calm of someone who had delivered both good and bad news in the same sentence many times before, and had learned that the kindest thing was not to separate them. The video showed a Doss Ranch vehicle and a person wearing Doss Ranch clothing, she explained. It showed that person opening the gate. It established motive and opportunity. What it didn't do on its own was definitively identify the individual. And Warren Doss's legal team would argue that even if it was a ranch employee, that didn't constitute proof that Doss himself ordered it. So we need the employee. We need more than the video, yes. Willa was quiet for a moment. What about the metadata? Patricia looked at her steadily. That, she said carefully, is exactly what I need to talk to you about. The battery drift issue, that was what Warren's lawyers called it eventually. But Patricia explained it first, 2 days before Warren's team filed anything, because she'd anticipated it the moment she saw the camera model. Trail cameras, the affordable kind, the kind a beekeeper buys to watch for coyotes and bears, ran on internal clocks that weren't synchronized to any external source. They ran on batteries, and batteries drained, and as they drained, the internal clock drifted, sometimes by seconds, sometimes over months by minutes. Cyrus's camera had drifted 4 minutes, which meant the timestamp showing 5:21 a.m. could have been 5:17 a.m. or 5:25 a.m. The margin of error wasn't large, but it was large enough. Large enough for an attorney who was paid to find large enough. Because here was the argument. If the timestamp was off by 4 minutes in one direction, the truck had arrived after the cattle were already in the field, which meant the employee, whoever he was, wasn't opening the gate for the cattle. He was arriving to check on escaped livestock, maybe even to close the gate, which was the opposite of what it looked like, and which couldn't be definitively ruled out. Patricia laid this out at the kitchen table with the kind of clarity that hurt, because clarity was what Willa had asked for. It wouldn't destroy the case, Patricia said, but it created uncertainty. And uncertainty was what the other side needed to work with. So the video is real and it might not matter. The video is real. The video shows exactly what it shows. What we need is something that corroborates the sequence, something that makes the timeline undeniable. Like what? Like someone who was there. The letter from the bank arrived on a Thursday. Willa found it in the mailbox when she came back from checking the south pasture fence. Plain envelope. Harding County Agricultural Bank return address. Her name typed on the front in the neutral font of official correspondence that never means good news. She opened it standing at the mailbox, because waiting until she was inside wouldn't make it different. The letter was 2 paragraphs. The first paragraph informed her that following a routine review of her account, the bank was requesting full repayment of her operating line of credit within 30 days. Not restructuring, not renegotiation, full repayment. The second paragraph said that if she had questions, she could contact the branch. At the bottom where the signature line was the name printed was Arthur Vance, senior loan officer, 22 years with the bank. The man her father had called Arthur when they talked on the phone. The man who had signed her own operating line 3 years ago, who had said at the time that the Ferris farm had always been a solid account, and he was glad to see her keeping it going. She read the letter again. She folded it. She put it in her jacket pocket. She walked back to the barn and stood in the middle of it for a moment. Her hands were at her sides. The air in the barn was warm and smelled of hay and animals and the particular comfortable dust of a working structure. And she thought this isn't routine, because she'd never had a review that triggered full repayment before, because her account was current, because she hadn't missed a payment or changed her usage or done anything that would prompt a review, except file a civil complaint against the most powerful landowner in the county. She thought someone talked to Arthur Vance. She thought, I can't prove that. She thought, I need Patricia. She called Patricia before she called anyone else. Patricia listened to the letter being read aloud without interrupting. When Willa finished, there was a pause. Don't panic yet, Patricia said. Don't call Vance. Let me handle the bank side of this. Do you think it's connected? Another pause, shorter. I think it's very inconvenient timing, which was the kind of non-answer that answered everything. Willa called Arthur Vance's direct line at 9 the next morning. Busy. She called again at 11. Busy. She left a message at 2 in the afternoon. Precise, unemotional, just her name and her account number, and the words reviewing your correspondence, and would appreciate a callback. He didn't call back that day, or the next. The silence from a man who had once called her father's account the best in the Eastern District settled into her stomach like cold water. She'd known Arthur Vance her whole life. Not closely, but the way you know the people who were part of your parents' world. The people who showed up at funerals and shook your hand with both of theirs and said your family was what this county was built on. That man was now not returning her phone calls. And somewhere between that fact and the 30-day clock ticking on her operating line, Willa understood something that she added to her notebook in very small words. She was not just fighting a neighbor. She was fighting someone who had been working at this for a long time, quietly, patiently. Someone who had already made arrangements she hadn't known to look for until they were already in place. She was not ahead. She was catching up. And catching up in a situation like this was not the same thing as being safe. Helen came on a Sunday evening, didn't knock this time, just called from the porch. Willa's name through the screen door, and when Willa came out, she was already sitting in the chair at the far end of the porch with her hands in her lap. No soup tonight, just Helen. They sat together while the light went down over the damaged field. The repaired sections were showing new growth in places small and cautious, the way plants return after trauma, not announcing themselves, just quietly resuming testing, whether conditions were worth the effort. Helen watched the field for a long time. I want to tell you something, and I need you to hear it the way I mean it. Willa turned toward her. Helen's voice was even when she spoke, like she'd rehearsed the evenness. She'd been 60 years old when she signed her farm over, she said. She was tired, 2 hard seasons back to back. The roof on the equipment shed needed replacing. The hay was bad. The bank was doing that thing banks do where they stop being patient all at once. She paused. I had pictures of my fence, of my gate. After the first time Doss's cattle got into my field, she looked at her hands. I took them because I thought I don't know what I thought. That someone would ask for them, that someone would care. Nobody asked. Nobody asked. I didn't have Patricia Olden. I had a neighbor who said these things happen, and a bank officer who said they were very sorry, but the numbers were the numbers. A breath, slow. So I signed. Willa didn't say anything, because there was nothing to say to that except the truth, which was that it could be her. Even now, even with the photographs and the drone and Cyrus's footage and Boyd's map and Patricia on her side. Even with all of that, she was 23 years old with a 30-day bank notice and a video that had a 4-minute question mark hanging over it. And if the right things fell apart in the right order, she could be exactly where Helen was, looking backward at a farm that used to have her name on it. I'm not telling you this to scare you. I know. I'm telling you because I want you to see that I see it, what you're doing, what it costs. Helen turned to look at her directly. Being tired and being beaten aren't the same thing. I know they feel the same sometimes. In the middle of the night, they feel exactly the same. But they're not. She stood up, smoothed her jacket. You've got something I didn't. You've got people who know you're right. That's not nothing. That's most of it, actually. She walked to the steps and stopped. Looked back once. Don't sign anything without calling Patricia first. Then she was gone down the drive and the light was almost fully gone, and Willa sat on the porch alone for a long time after that. Warren Doss sat at the counter at Millard's Diner on a Wednesday morning and talked loud enough to be heard from 3 stools down. This was not accidental. He talked about young people who didn't understand what they were getting into, about the difference between keeping a piece of land and actually running a viable operation. He talked about the complexity of agricultural litigation with the patience of a man who had sat across from attorneys many more times than the other side could afford. A few people nodded. A few didn't. Most of them had heard the other version of the story by now. The version from Boyd's feed store visits from Cyrus, mentioning the camera to his neighbor, from the organic spread of information that moves through a small county, the way water moves through soil, not loudly, not in a rush, but steadily finding every crack. But Warren's version was louder, and louder counted for something in a county diner on a Wednesday morning before most people had formed a firm opinion about anything. He said something else toward the end. He said it with the calm tone of a man making a factual observation. I feel for her, I do. But there's a reason the farm got passed to a 23-year-old. Nobody else was lining up to take it on. 3 people looked down at their coffee. 1 didn't. An older woman at the corner table, gray-haired someone's grandmother, by the look of it, set down her fork and looked at Warren Doss with the particular expression that some women carry after 60 years of watching men explain things they don't understand. She didn't say anything. She just looked. And Warren, for just a moment, looked away first. Leon Pratt knocked on the door at 6:30 on a Friday evening. I was still in his work clothes, or what had been his work clothes. The jacket had the Doss Ranch embroidery, the same jacket she realized looking at it that was visible on the trail camera footage, which meant she was looking at the person in the footage, which she had already suspected, but suspecting and seeing in person are different weights on the chest. He didn't say anything when she opened the door. I looked like a man who had been awake for a long time. The kind of awake that isn't about sleep. She stepped back. He came in. He stood in the kitchen and she poured 2 cups of coffee without asking and set one in front of him, and they stood on opposite sides of the table because it seemed like a conversation that needed a table between it. I was let go this morning. I heard. He wrapped both hands around the mug. 14 years. She waited because she'd learned over the past several days that the moment before someone says the real thing is a moment that needs to be respected. Push it and it closes. Give it room and sometimes it opens. Leon looked at the mug. He looked at his hands around the mug. He looked at the wall behind her, where the family photographs were. Her parents. The farm in summer in a frame her mother had painted in a bad weather season when she needed something to do with her hands. He looked at that photograph for a long time. The man in that picture, he said slowly. She waited. I know his face. He said it plainly. The way people say things they've been practicing, saying things they've turned over so many times in their own heads that by the time they come out, they're worn smooth. He'd opened the Ferris gate 7 years ago, spring. He'd driven out early before sunrise and he'd lifted the latch and opened the gate and driven away and not looked back. He'd done it because Warren Doss had told him to, because Warren had said the neighboring farm was going to be going through some reorganization and they needed the cattle to have access to the lower pasture for a few days. He'd believed that, or he'd believed enough of it to do it. I didn't know it was the Ferris farm. Not by name. Not as the farm belonging to the man in the photograph on Willa's kitchen wall. I didn't connect it. The farm I was sent to, I didn't know the name. I just knew the location. Just a gate on the west side of County Line Road before the creek crossing. He looked up. I didn't know it was your father's land until... He stopped. Until right now. He didn't say it. Didn't have to. Until he was standing in this kitchen looking at that photograph. Willa set down her coffee. She set it down carefully because there was something happening in her chest that she needed to manage. Something that was not quite anger and not quite grief and was in fact a mixture that didn't have a clean name. The man standing across from her had opened the gate on her father's farm, had done the same thing to the same family in the same way 7 years apart. And her father had stood at the kitchen window at midnight checking the fence. And her father had never known why the gate was opened or who had opened it. And now she did. And the person who had done it was standing in her kitchen holding a coffee mug and looking like what he was, which was a man who had done something wrong without fully understanding it was wrong, which was not the same as a man who had done something wrong knowingly, which was not the same as Warren Doss, but which was also not nothing. Why are you telling me this? He didn't answer immediately. He looked at his hands. He said he'd been doing the math. Every farm on that road, every gate he'd opened in 14 years. He knew something was wrong. He just hadn't let himself name it. He set down the mug, and now he was 41 years old with no job, and he was looking at her father's face on that wall, and he was done not naming it. She stood very still. I'll testify, if it comes to that. What she didn't know yet, and wouldn't learn until later, was what had happened to Leon in the 3 days between the morning he'd been fired and the evening he'd knocked on her door. She'd learn it piece by piece, from Leon directly, from a detail he added at the end of one of his conversations with Patricia. The morning after his termination, a man had come to his house. Not Warren, never Warren directly. A man who worked adjacent to the ranch in some capacity that Leon couldn't quite pin down, who sat in Leon's kitchen in a way that mirrored the way Leon was now sitting in Willa's kitchen, except with a different energy, not confessional, transactional. The man had mentioned Leon's rental situation. The house where Leon and his daughter lived was on County Road property adjacent to the Doss Ranch. The lease was month to month, which everyone had always understood to be a courtesy given the employment relationship. The man had mentioned Leon's daughter's school fees for the fall. I hadn't said anything threatening, nothing that could be quoted as a threat. He just mentioned things in that careful tone that powerful people use when they want to apply pressure while maintaining the appearance of conversation. He'd left without asking for anything directly, which was the most effective kind of pressure, because it left Leon to fill in the blanks himself, left him to sit in his own kitchen and build the cage from the inside. Leon had sat in that kitchen for 2 days, thinking about his daughter, about the lease, about 14 years of work that had just been ended with a single morning conversation, about the fact that doing the right thing was going to cost him something real and immediate and tangible, while doing nothing would cost him something slower and interior and harder to see. He'd knocked on Willa's door on the third day, because some prices he decided were worth paying, and some weren't. The contract arrived on a Monday, not through Patricia, not through any attorney, through the regular mail in an envelope with the Doss Ranch return address, as if it were a catalog or an invoice, or something that had been routinely expected. Willa opened it at the kitchen table. The offer was double what he'd first proposed 3 years ago. It was a substantial number, written out carefully broken into purchase price and settlement agreement, and a clause that would, upon signing, withdraw any pending litigation between the parties. She set the pages down. She looked at the wall. She looked at her notebook open to the page where she'd written the figures from the extension office, what the field would have yielded, what the replacement hay would cost, what 2 consecutive damaged seasons would do to the operating line, what 30 days meant in practical terms. She looked at the window. Dark outside, just beginning. The farm going quiet the way it went quiet every evening, all that daily noise settling into something softer and steadier. She thought about Helen, 60 years old, tired, signing. She thought about her father at the midnight window, checking the west gate, not knowing why, knowing why. She thought about Boyd's map with 6 red marks and the 7th one that hadn't happened yet, because she was the 7th. She was the one who was supposed to be so exhausted, so financially stretched, so fundamentally alone that eventually the number would look better than the fight. And the number was good. She was being honest with herself. The number was good. Her hand moved toward the pen. Just moved. Not because she decided to. Just the gravitational pull of the easier path, doing what gravity does, which is find the lowest point and aim for it. The pen was in her hand. She looked at the contract. She looked at her father's face on the wall. She thought about what he had said standing at the truck in that conversation her mother had written about. The conversation her mother had watched from the kitchen window. That land has been in this family since my grandfather, and that is how it will stay. He hadn't said it to Warren. He'd said it to himself. An accounting, a declaration. Not a promise to Warren Doss, but a fact of the world as he understood it delivered out loud to make it more real. Willa set the pen down. She folded the contract. She put it in the drawer. She opened her notebook to a new page and wrote day 11. Evening. Offer received. Not accepted. And then she called Patricia and told her exactly what had arrived. Leon came back on a Wednesday. She didn't expect him. He knocked twice short the way someone knocks when they're not entirely sure they should be there. She opened the door. He looked, if anything, more tired than the last time. But the energy was different. The previous visit had been full of the specific weight of a confession being made. This one was something else. Quieter, more decided. He reached into his jacket pocket. He produced a piece of paper. Small. Folded into quarters many times over. The edges were soft with age, the way paper gets when it's been opened and refolded so many times the fibers start to let go of each other. He set it on the table. She looked at it, didn't touch it. He'd been carrying it for 14 years, he said, since the first gate. His first job for Warren was one he hadn't understood at the time. He was new. Warren had handed him a note and told him what to do, and he did it. After he'd had a feeling, he couldn't describe it any other way, just a feeling that he'd crossed something. So he'd kept the note. He'd kept every note Warren gave him before a job like that. In case. In case of what? The question was quiet, and his answer was just as quiet. In case someone like you came along and needed it. Willa reached out and unfolded the paper. Small handwriting. Economical. Instructions in 3 lines, no preamble, no signature. She read it. She read it again. She felt something that was not quite triumph and not quite relief, but was in the neighborhood of both. Something that sat in her chest like a change in weather. The kind you feel before the front actually arrives. She looked up at Leon. He was watching her with the expression of a man who has finally set something heavy down after carrying it so long he'd forgotten it wasn't part of his body. I'm sorry about your father's field. I didn't know whose it was. She held the paper carefully because it was 14 years old and she didn't want it to fall apart now. I know, she said, and outside the kitchen window, the sky was going the particular shade of indigo that comes just before full dark. Somewhere in the distance, a farm dog barked once and stopped. The field was out there healing at its own pace, growing back in the incremental, stubborn way that things grow back when the conditions are still worth growing into. The paper was in her hand, and in the morning, she was calling Patricia. The night before the hearing, Willa didn't review anything. She had reviewed everything already, dozens of times. In the weeks since Leon had laid that folded piece of paper on her kitchen table, Patricia had built the case the way a good fence gets built, post by post, wire by wire, nothing assumed and nothing left to hold by luck alone. Every photograph had been cataloged. Every timestamp had been independently verified by a digital forensics consultant Patricia had used before a woman in the city who specialized in exactly this kind of challenge and who had produced a 14-page report on the camera's battery drift rate, the calibration margin, and the statistical probability that the footage sequence was as captured. The 4-minute question, answered. Gerald Marsh's agricultural assessment ran to 62 pages. Aerial comparisons, soil core samples, yield calculations, cross-referenced against 4 seasons of Ferris production records. The number at the bottom of his report had made Patricia set her glasses down when she first read it. Not because it was inflated, because it was exact, because every single figure had a source citation and a methodology note and a comparable regional data point. And there was the note, 14 years old, soft at the folds. The handwriting confirmed by a questioned document examiner, a licensed forensic specialist who had testified in dozens of civil and criminal cases in this state, and who had spent 6 hours comparing the note's letter forms to samples of Warren Doss's signature obtained through the discovery process. 3 lines of instruction, no signature, but his hand. Definitively, documentably, his hand. There was also the matter of Frank Ferris's withdrawal letter. 6 years ago, under serious financial pressure after an early loan call-in, Frank had signed a letter of intent to sell. 8 days later, he'd reversed course entirely. He'd sent his withdrawal by certified mail, 1 copy to Doss Ranch's attorney of record, 1 copy retained by the bank holding his operating loan as documentation of a change in the borrower's real property intentions. That bank copy was still in the transaction file. Both documents existed. Warren Doss's legal team had access to the same records as anyone else. They had chosen to produce only one of them. Patricia had found the other 3 weeks ago through a straightforward records request. So Willa didn't review any of it the night before. She made soup instead. The same recipe Helen had brought in a Dutch oven the evening of the first day, because it had been good soup and because cooking something that required attention was the right use of a mind that needed to stay away from its own edges. She ate at the kitchen table. She read the middle section of her mother's journal. Not the entries she'd been mining for evidence, the ordinary ones. The ones about the garden, about a calf born in a February cold snap, about the way the light came through the equipment shed door in late October. The entries that were just Dana Ferris living a life and writing it down because writing things down was how she made sense of them. After the dishes were done, Willa went out to the porch. The night was clear, cold in the way that April nights are cold, When the days have been warm, a false summer in the afternoons, and then the real season returning after dark to remind you it wasn't finished yet. Stars everywhere. The kind of sky that makes the county feel small in a way that's comforting rather than claustrophobic. Just land, just dark, just the fence line running west. She stood there for a while, not checking the gate, not watching for anything, just standing there because it was her porch, her land, the same ground her grandfather had worked and her father after him, and now her 23 years old alone, and not alone frightened, and not frightened. Both things at once, which she'd learned was the normal condition of a person who was doing something that mattered. She went inside at 9:30, set her alarm, laid her clothes out for the morning. The good flannel, the cleaner pair of jeans, the canvas jacket brushed off and hanging straight. She turned off the light, and in the dark she said out loud to no one or to someone, "I did the work," which was all she needed to say. The Harding County Courthouse opened its main doors at 8:15. It was a building that had been holding the weight of local consequence since 1932. Not imposing, not the kind of building you'd photograph if you were passing through. Just solid, just present. Brick the color of old rust-wide steps worn at the center from decades of people climbing them toward whatever verdict they were hoping for. Willa arrived at 8:45. Patricia was already there in the hallway outside courtroom 2, reviewing something on her tablet with the focused stillness of someone who had already moved past nervous into simply ready. She looked up when Willa came through the door. She didn't say good morning. She said the forensics report was in the exhibit binder under tab C, and if they challenged the chain of custody on the camera card, she'd redirect to the metadata report. Willa nodded, understood, and that was enough. The gallery filled faster than either of them expected. Word had moved through the county in the weeks since the complaint was filed. Not as gossip, or not only as gossip, but as something with more substance. People had been watching. Boyd's Feed Store was a kind of information clearinghouse that had been operating quietly in that direction for 30 years. Cyrus had mentioned things to his neighbors. Gerald Marsh had colleagues who talked to other farmers. And Helen Mackey, who had been silent about her own experience for 5 years, had started not being silent. Quietly, in the specific way that women who have been quiet for a long time become not quiet. One conversation at a time, one cup of coffee, one phone call that became two. Each one a small stone dropped in still water and the circles moving outward. The benches were not quite full, but they were close enough. Warren Doss entered at 8:55. I was wearing the right suit. He knew how to dress for rooms like this one. He came in with his attorney and a second attorney, and he moved through the space with the practiced ease of a man who had sat in important rooms before and understood that confidence was the first argument you made before anyone said a word. He greeted two people in the gallery. He did not look at Willa, which was, she thought, its own kind of statement. The conspicuous absence of acknowledgement, the aggressive performance of not seeing someone who was sitting 12 feet away. She looked straight ahead and let him not see her. The judge was Margaret Ellery, 63 years old, 21 years on the bench in this county. She had the particular quality of attention that belongs to people who have heard a great many versions of a great many stories and have developed a very precise instrument for sensing when a version is incomplete. She came in without ceremony, sat, looked at both tables. We're here in the matter of Ferris versus Doss. Plaintiff alleges intentional property damage. Defendant maintains the matter constitutes escaped livestock resulting from negligence at most. A pause. Ms. Olden, you may begin. Patricia stood. She had 7 minutes of opening statement. Willa had listened to it 4 times during preparation, and it still worked because it was built the way Patricia built everything, not on emotion, not on outrage, but on sequence. This happened, then this, supported by this document, this photograph, this testimony. Warren's lead attorney, a man named Sellers, who had driven up from the city and charged accordingly, offered a counter that was equally practiced. An unfortunate incident between neighboring properties, a gate mechanism that failed, an employee who made an error in judgment, his client's decades of responsible stewardship of this land. The word accident appeared 6 times in 4 minutes, which Willa noted, because when a word appears 6 times in 4 minutes, it's not because it's accurate. It's because someone has decided repetition is the strategy. Gerald Marsh took the stand first. I was a large, patient man who gave the impression of having measured more fields than he could count and having arrived through sheer accumulation of data at a kind of philosophical calm about numbers. He presented the aerial comparison photographs first. Pre-incident from Willa's own drone archive. Post-incident from the morning after. Then a third set taken at 2-week intervals during the recovery period. The difference was visible to everyone in the courtroom without needing to be explained. But he explained it anyway, precisely, citing the methodology, citing the comparable regional data, citing the accepted standards for calculating forage loss in a standing crop at the pre-harvest stage. He described how trampling at this specific growth stage didn't just reduce the current yield, but disrupted the root crowns in a way that affected subsequent cuttings. He described the soil compaction measurements and what they meant for the following season. Sellers cross-examined for 20 minutes. He challenged the sampling methodology. He challenged the comparison sites used as regional benchmarks. He asked whether it was possible for cattle to cause less damage if they moved through quickly rather than grazing at leisure. Gerald Marsh answered every question, calmly, returning each time to the data. He had the forensic accountant's version of patience, the kind that comes not from temperament, but from certainty. He knew what his numbers said. They didn't change under questioning. Then Patricia introduced the drone footage from the morning of the incident. The courtroom, it was a bench trial judge. Ellery, ruling alone, watched 63 black Angus cattle moving through standing hay that was 3 weeks from harvest. The scale of the spread, the systematic coverage of the field, the comparison with the untouched northern section, which showed in adjacent frames what the whole field had looked like 2 hours earlier. Patricia let the footage speak for what it was. Then she said, "Your Honor, we'd like to introduce Exhibit 7. The courtroom lights didn't dim exactly, but there was a shift in attention. The particular gathering in of a room that knows it's about to see something it hasn't seen before. The screen resolved to trail camera footage, night vision green-gray, the fence line, the gate, the timestamp, 5:21 a.m., the truck pulling up, the logo on the door, the man getting out, moving directly to the gate, lifting the latch with no hesitation, swinging it open, getting back in the truck, driving away." The corrected timestamp following the independent forensic calibration was displayed in a small notation in the corner of the screen. Patricia had anticipated the battery drift challenge and pre-answered it in the exhibit itself. The cattle began coming through at 5:28 a.m. The courtroom was very quiet. Sellers stood. "The footage identifies a vehicle and a garment. It does not identify my client." "We agree," Patricia said, "which is why we'd like to call our next witness." Leon Pratt walked in through the side door. He'd trimmed his beard. His boots were clean. He was wearing a shirt that was clearly not a work shirt, pressed dark blue. The kind of shirt a man puts on when he understands that what he does in the next hour will be a matter of permanent record. He walked to the witness stand without looking at Warren Doss, which was interesting because the courtroom was arranged such that walking to the stand required passing fairly close to the defense table, and a person could not entirely avoid being aware of someone sitting that close. Leon did not look at Warren. He looked straight ahead, then at the clerk for the oath, then at Patricia when she began. She asked him to identify himself. He did. 14 years with Doss Ranch, terminated 12 days ago. She asked him whether he recognized the person in the trail camera footage. "That's me." She asked him whether he had opened the gate. "Yes." She asked him whether he had done so on his own initiative or on instruction. Leon placed both hands flat on the railing in front of him. He looked at them for a moment. Just a moment. The kind of pause that isn't hesitation but is instead a person making sure they're going to say the thing accurately. On instruction, Sellers was on his feet. Your Honor, I'd like to establish the basis for this claim before the witness continues. Overruled. Judge Ellery didn't look up from her notes. The witness may continue. Counsel will have an opportunity for cross. Patricia looked at Leon. Who gave you that instruction? Warren Doss. The room absorbed this. Warren leaned toward Sellers. A hand on his attorney's arm, low, a gesture meant to be invisible and not entirely succeeding. Patricia continued steadily. She asked whether Doss had explained the purpose of leaving the gate open. Not directly. Leon's voice was even, calibrated. He said the Western Neighbors operation was going to be changing and that the timing was important. He said to leave the gate before sunrise and not to discuss it. And did you understand what he meant by that? At the time, I told myself I didn't. Looking back, I knew. Sellers stood again. Objection, speculation about the defendant's intent. Sustained, Judge Ellery said. The witness will confine himself to facts. Patricia adjusted without pausing. She asked whether Doss had communicated that instruction in writing. Leon reached into the inside pocket of his pressed blue shirt. He removed a piece of paper, folded into quarters, soft at the edges. He unfolded it with the care of someone handling something that has been important for a long time without ever quite being used. He placed it on the railing. He gave me a note before the first gate I ever opened for him. I kept it, all of them. I have 3. This is the most recent one that applies to the Ferris property. Patricia crossed to the witness stand and received the paper. She held it toward the court reporter who logged it as Exhibit 14. Then she read it aloud. 3 lines, the handwriting small. Economical. Leave the west gate open before sunrise Tuesday. Say nothing. No signature. Patricia let the silence hold for a moment. Then she turned to the bench. Your Honor, Exhibit 15 is a report of a question document examiner retained by the plaintiff, a licensed forensic specialist with extensive prior case history in this state. The report concludes at a confidence level of 94% that the handwriting in Exhibit 14 matches samples of Warren Doss's handwriting obtained through discovery. She set the exhibit binder on the judge's desk. We have no further questions for this witness. Sellers' cross-examination of Leon lasted 35 minutes. He asked whether Leon had been promised anything for his testimony. Leon said no. He asked whether Leon had been pressured. Leon said no. He asked whether Leon bore any personal grievance against Warren Doss following his termination. Leon looked at him steadily. I have a grievance, but that's not why I'm here. Then why are you here? Leon looked at his hands. Because I've been carrying that piece of paper for 14 years, and I'd like to put it down. Sellers tried several more angles. He suggested the note could refer to any number of operational tasks. He suggested Leon's interpretation of the instruction was subjective. He suggested that without a clear context established in the document itself, the note proved nothing about intent. Leon answered each challenge the same way, calmly, with the particular patience of a man who has already made his decision and doesn't need to be talked back into it. After 35 minutes, Sellers sat down, and the courtroom was quiet in a way it had not been quiet before. Patricia called no more witnesses. She rested the plaintiff's case. Sellers called a character witness, a fellow rancher who had worked alongside Warren Doss for 20 years, and who spoke to his reputation for responsible land management. He called a fence specialist who testified that gate latches of that model and age could fail spontaneously under weather conditions. He called Warren's ranch manager, who said that the morning in question had involved significant cattle movement on the property and that escapes were not unheard of. Each witness was measured, professional, plausible in isolation. But isolation was not the condition they were being heard in. They were being heard after the footage, after Leon, after the note in Warren Doss's own handwriting. And then came the moment Willa hadn't expected. She had been prepared for many things. Patricia had spent considerable time preparing her for counter-arguments, evidentiary challenges, character attacks. She had gone through the discovery process with the methodical calm she brought to everything. But this particular document she had not known about. Sellers placed a single sheet of paper on the judge's desk. Your Honor, the defense would like to introduce Exhibit D9, a letter of intent to sell executed by Frank Ferris, the father of the plaintiff, approximately 6 years ago. The letter was addressed to Doss Ranch and expressed a willingness to consider an offer for the Ferris property. The room shifted. Not loudly. There was no gasp, no audible reaction. Just the particular shift in atmospheric pressure that happens when a room full of people collectively inhale and don't immediately exhale. Willa went still, very still. Her hands were on her thighs under the table. She pressed them down flat against the denim. She felt her father's face on the kitchen wall. She felt the journal entry her mother had written Frank coming in from the truck, making coffee, not talking. That land has been in this family since my grandfather. He had signed something. Her father had signed something. She hadn't known. She kept her face exactly as it was. Because showing nothing right now was the most important thing she could do, and she knew it, and she was doing it. She was doing it the way her father had kept his hands still at his sides when Warren Doss stood at his truck. Not because she wasn't feeling anything, because she was feeling too many things, and none of them were going to help her in the next 5 minutes. Sellers continued. The plaintiff's father was at one point willing to entertain a sale, he said. This suggested the relationship between the Ferris property and Doss Ranch was not one of simple opposition, but of ongoing negotiation. The alleged pressure campaign was inconsistent with the documented record, which showed a seller who had expressed voluntary interest. Patricia was already moving. She stood before Sellers finished his sentence. Your Honor, may I respond to the exhibit before it enters the record? Briefly, Patricia opened her own binder. Tab F. Willa had seen it, had read the exhibit herself the night Patricia had shown it to her, had sat very still in that moment too, reading her mother's words. Exhibit D9 is a partial document, Patricia said. Your Honor, Exhibit P22 is the corresponding record from the bank that held Frank Ferris's operating loan at the time. She placed the document on the bench. Frank Ferris had executed the letter of intent under documented financial distress. She explained his operating loan had been called in early following a crop loss season. The letter was drafted under duress. 8 days later, Mr. Ferris mailed a formal written withdrawal by certified mail 1 copy to Doss Ranch's attorney of record 1 copy, retained by the bank in his transaction file as documentation of the changed position. Standard practice for reversing a letter of intent in a small county real property matter. That bank file was still intact. Both documents had existed in accessible records for 6 years. She looked at Judge Ellery. Warren Doss's legal team had access to the same bank records as the plaintiff through discovery. They introduced one document and not the other. The room was very quiet. Judge Ellery looked at the withdrawal letter. She looked at the original. She looked at Sellers over her reading glasses. Sellers said nothing, which was Willa thought its own kind of statement. Closing arguments were careful on both sides. Patricia's was 12 minutes. She walked through the evidence in sequence one final time. The latch, the footage, the forensic calibration, Leon's testimony, the note, the pattern of 6 properties documented over 5 years by Boyd Pierce's informal map, which had been entered as a supporting contextual exhibit, the financial impact established by Gerald Marsh. She ended simply. The plaintiff came to this court with photographs, measurements, recorded footage, expert analysis, and the sworn testimony of a man who was there. She came without exaggeration and without speculation. Every single piece of evidence in this case does one thing: it tells the truth, and the truth assembled carefully and completely is enough. Sellers' closing ran 15 minutes and used the word accident 11 times. Willa counted. Judge Ellery retired to consider. The gallery waited. Willa sat at the plaintiff's table and did not talk to anyone for a while. Patricia reviewed her notes. Boyd was somewhere in the gallery. She hadn't looked back during the session, but she knew he was there. She had seen his truck in the lot. Cyrus too, probably. She hadn't looked. Helen was there. She knew because Helen had touched her shoulder briefly in the hallway before the session began. Just the light pressure of a hand. No words. Just, "I'm here," which was enough. The deliberation took 2 hours and 14 minutes. 2 hours and 14 minutes during which Willa ate half a granola bar and drank a bottle of water and read the same page of the county's annual agricultural extension report 3 times without absorbing any of it. During which Patricia took 2 phone calls and made 3 notes. During which Warren Doss sat at the defense table in his good suit and looked at the middle distance with the expression of a man calculating. And then the door opened, and they went back in. Judge Ellery settled at the bench. She did not preamble. She did not set the stage. She opened the folder in front of her and she read, "In the matter of Ferris versus Doss, I have reviewed the testimony, the physical evidence, the expert reports, and the applicable statutes governing intentional damage to agricultural property in this state." The room was perfectly still. The footage submitted by the plaintiff clearly establishes that the gate was opened deliberately and that the opening was followed in direct sequence by the cattle entering the plaintiff's field. The forensic report addressing the camera's clock variance confirms with high confidence that the sequence of events is as the footage depicts. She turned a page. The witness, Leon Pratt, testified credibly and consistently. His testimony was not contradicted by physical evidence, was corroborated by the documentary exhibit, and was delivered without apparent inducement or coercion. The court finds his account credible. She looked up briefly, then back down. The handwritten note, authenticated by a qualified forensic examiner, constitutes direct documentary evidence of intent. The content of the note instructing a specific action at a specific time, followed by silence, is not consistent with routine ranch operations or innocent error. It is consistent with deliberate planning. Warren Doss was looking at the judge. His attorney had a hand on his arm. With respect to the letter of intent introduced by the defense, the court considered both the letter and the subsequent written withdrawal, which are equally matters of documented record, in which the court notes were not both presented by the defense. The plaintiff's father's withdrawal of interest, executed 8 days after the original letter and retained in the bank's transaction file, negates the argument that the Ferris family had any ongoing intent to sell. She paused. One breath. The court finds in favor of the plaintiff, Willa Ferris. Not a gasp, not applause, just the sound of a room breathing again. Collectively, all at once. The sound of air being released after 2 hours and 14 minutes and really 3 years. Warren Doss looked at the table. Just the table. Judge Ellery continued reading the damages. Documented crop loss calculated precisely by Gerald Marsh. Replacement feed costs for the winter. Reseeding and soil recovery. Additional fertilizer. Fence labor and materials. Expert witness and assessment costs. Court fees. Every number matched the evidence. Not $1 more. Not $1 less. Just what the evidence said. Just what the work had established. Just the truth measured to the penny. She set down the folder. The court emphasizes that this judgment reflects evidence and law. It is not a statement about reputation or community standing. It is a statement about what happened on the morning of May the 8th on the western boundary of the Ferris property. She picked up the gavel. The private property rights of every landowner in this county depend on the principle that those rights will be equally protected regardless of the size of the operation or the wealth of the parties. One strike. Court adjourned. Outside on the courthouse steps, 2 reporters from the county paper waited with notebooks. Warren Doss left through the side exit. Quickly, without stopping, without the greeting people movement that he'd made when he arrived. Willa came out the front door. The afternoon light was sharp and clean, the kind that only happens in April when the angle is still low enough to catch the edges of things. Boyd was on the steps, Cyrus behind him, and Helen standing to the side, hands in her coat pockets, looking at Willa with the expression of someone who has just watched a thing they had given up believing in happen anyway. One of the reporters asked if she felt vindicated. She thought about the word. Vindicated. which implied she'd been waiting to be proved right, which implied the whole thing had been about being right. I wanted the damage to be recognized. That's what the court did. She thanked them and walked toward her truck. In the weeks that followed, things moved with the particular momentum of consequences that had been waiting to be set in motion. Warren's insurance company reviewed the judgment, which took 4 days. Then they sent a letter. The letter explained in the careful language of policy documents that coverage under the property and liability portions of his ranch policy was contingent on incidents of accidental or negligent nature. The court's finding of intentional conduct placed the incident outside that coverage. They would not be paying, which meant Warren Doss was paying, out of his own accounts, his own operating funds. The full amount that Gerald Marsh had calculated, which was not ruinous. Warren Doss had 1,800 acres in the financial infrastructure that came with it, but which was real, and which was his. The bank investigation took longer. Patricia had filed a separate request through the state banking regulator, raising the question of whether the timing of the operating line demand to Willa had been influenced by external factors rather than routine review. The regulator's office opened a file. It would take months, maybe longer. The wheels of that particular machine ground slowly and without drama. Arthur Vance submitted his resignation before the investigation was 2 weeks old. I didn't make a statement. He just resigned, effective immediately. 30 years of employment ended in a single letter to the board. People talked about it for a while in the county. Some said he was protecting himself. Some said he was protecting someone else. Some said the two things were the same. Willa didn't spend time on it. She had a field to tend. Spring arrived the way it always did in Harding County. Not all at once. In arguments and counter-arguments. A warm week followed by a cold snap, followed by 2 weeks of steady growing weather that made everything forgive the cold snap retroactively. The hayfield had been showing green since March, not fully recovered, not the thick, even stand of the previous year, but growing. The reseeded sections were threading through with new roots patiently filling the gaps left by hooves in winter. The sections that had been worst trampled were the slowest to return. But they were not dead, not any of them. Alive, just moving at their own pace, which she had decided was good enough. On a Saturday in early May, almost exactly 1 year from the morning, the cattle came through. Willa was in the equipment shed doing a preseason check on the baler when she heard a truck in the driveway. Then another. She came out of the shed and found Boyd Pierce pulling in with his tractor on a trailer behind his pickup. Just pulling in, not calling ahead, not asking, just pulling in the way a person arrives at a place where they know they're needed. Cyrus Webb pulled in behind him. 2 younger men she recognized from neighboring operations came after that, in separate trucks. One of them had his teenage son with him. None of them appeared to have coordinated. They had simply arrived at approximately the same time on approximately the same morning, because word moves through a small county, and people who have been watching from a distance sometimes decide without announcement that watching is over. By mid-morning, there were 11 people in the field. Boyd running the mower, 2 of the younger men raking in parallel. Cyrus, who did not have a rake license, as he cheerfully informed everyone, had designated himself the lunch coordinator and had set up a folding table near the barn with an organization that impressed Willa considerably. Nobody said anything formal. Nobody made a speech. Nobody designated it as a community event or gave it a name. It was just people who knew what a field needed and had decided today was the day to need it. By 2 in the afternoon, the first sections were baled. Square bales moving up the wagon in the clean mechanical rhythm that is one of the most satisfying sounds in farming. The smell of cut hay and warm air. The light going gold over the hills to the west. Willa was stacking when she noticed Helen, standing at the fence line, the same fence where the gate was. The new gate with the reinforced hinges and the heavy lock and the small sensor camera mounted on the post above it. Helen was standing there with her hands in her jacket pockets, looking out over the field, looking at the bales, looking at the people moving between the rows. She was crying, not dramatically, not in the way that calls attention to itself, in the quiet way that some grief and some relief look identical from a distance, in the way of someone standing in the presence of a thing they had stopped believing was possible and finding out they were wrong. Boyd pulled the tractor to a stop near the fence line. He climbed down slowly. He walked over to Helen. He stood beside her. He didn't say anything. He put his hands in his own pockets and stood there with her, and they watched the field together. That was all. It was enough. Late afternoon. Most of the wagons were full. The first round of bales was in the barn. Willa was standing near the new gate with a pair of fencing pliers she'd been using to tighten the upper strand, and she was looking at the field in the way you look at something when you're trying to let it be real. The grass was not perfect. It was not the field she'd grown up watching her father tend. It was not the field of 4 years ago, or even last year. It was a field that had been damaged and reseeded and carefully fertilized and watched through a cold winter and an uncertain spring, and had come back the way damaged things come back when they're given what they need. Imperfect. Alive. Hers. She was still looking when she heard the engine. Slow. On the county road. The white truck. She knew it without looking. Recognized the speed of it, the particular engine sound. Warren Doss drove the way he'd always driven on this road. Like he had every reason to be there. Which, to be fair, he did. It was a county road. It was public. He slowed when he reached the section where the fence line was visible from the road, where the field opened up and you could see the wagons and the people and the bales stacked in rows near the barn. He slowed enough to look. She could see him in profile through the windshield. Not his expression, just the shape of him, the hat, the stillness. He sat there for a moment, looking at the field that was supposed to have broken her, the field that was supposed to be his, the field that was standing there alive and baled and loaded and surrounded by people who had come without being asked, covered in the ordinary evidence that it had survived. He didn't roll the window down. He didn't wave. After a moment, he shifted the truck into gear, and he drove on. She watched his taillights disappear around the bend in the county road. Then she turned back to the fence. The new gate was solid. She tested the latch, the new latch, heavy-duty steel, no play in it, the kind that required a deliberate two-step motion to open and didn't move for anything less. The hinges were freshly greased. The camera above the gate was small, unobtrusive, but there. She tested the latch one more time. Latched. She picked up her fencing pliers and walked back toward the barn. Cyrus had put out supper on the folding table, something from a slow cooker, the smell of it reaching all the way to the fence line. Boyd was helping Helen to the table. The younger men were finishing the last of the afternoon stacking. Someone had found a radio somewhere, and there was music faint carrying across the field in the warm, early evening air. Willa set the fencing pliers on the tailgate of her truck. She washed her hands from the jug she kept in the cab. She stood for a moment at the edge of the gathering looking at it. 11 people who had shown up. Supper on a folding table. The barn doors open. The smell of cut hay and warm food and diesel in spring. And the field, green, baled, alive. She felt something she didn't immediately have a word for. Not triumph, not relief exactly. Something quieter than either of those. Something that lived underneath them. The specific feeling of a person who has held something together through a long, difficult time and is now, for the first time in a while, able to just be in it. Without bracing, without calculating, without checking the west fence one more time before bed. Just here. Just this. Boyd looked over and caught her eye. I didn't smile exactly. Boyd Pierce didn't smile easily, and she'd learned to read the smaller version. The slight shift around his eyes. The brief nod that meant something more than acknowledgement. It meant, I see it. She walked to the table and picked up a bowl. Because there was supper and the evening was long and beautiful, and the field was real and the work would continue tomorrow the way it always did. And in the morning she would check the fence, not because she was afraid, because that's what a farmer does. Because the land needs tending, and tending is love made practical, and practical love is the most durable kind there is. Because her father had known this. and her mother had written it down, and now it was hers to carry forward, into another season, into whatever came next. Nobody said her father's name out loud. Nobody said her mother's name out loud, but they were there, in the table and the tools and the notebooks on the shelf, in the gate that stood closed and locked at the end of the repaired fence, in the field that had come back, in the girl, the woman standing at the edge of the gathered light eating soup on a May evening, finally still. The land had remembered how to grow, so had she.